The bridge shuddered like a wounded animal while everyone else ran the other way. I went back. Through the groan of steel and the cracking of asphalt, I saw her, the chief executive of the company that had fired me, trapped in an overturned vehicle sliding toward open air. I did. I broke the glass, pulled her out, and walked her across the deck as if I already knew where the span would die. When we reached solid ground, a convoy of Marines rolled in. Their commander stared at me a long moment and asked a question that changed everything. "Who is that man?" If you like stories where an ordinary man hides an extraordinary past, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. 36 hours before the Hawthorne River Bridge fell into the water, I was lying on my back beneath it with a flashlight in my teeth, counting things that did not add up. My name is Nolan Avery. I was 41 years old, and my job that week was a subcontract nobody wanted. 3 days of visual and instrument inspection on a structure that had just been through a 14-month rehabilitation. The company that owned the contract was Sterling Meridian Infrastructure, a name that appeared on green highway signs across 4 states, and the men who signed my checks had never once come out to look at what they were paying for. I wore work pants with a torn knee and drove a pickup with 190,000 miles on it. To the people upstairs, I was a line item. That is the part of the story I want you to hold on to, because everything that happened later grew out of it. What I found was not dramatic in the way people imagine failure. There was no smoking hole, no crack you could see from a passing car. There was a gusset plate at panel .9 on the east truss, one of the connections that had supposedly been replaced during the rehabilitation, and it was wrong. The bolt pattern did not match the approved drawings. The steel had a mill mark I did not recognize and a surface finish that looked cheaper than what the specification called for. Worse, when I ran the strain gauges across a normal afternoon of traffic, the load path was not behaving the way the design model said it should. Force was migrating. That connection was quietly handing its work to neighbors that were never meant to carry it. So I did what the manual says to do. I wrote an urgent condition report and I recommended 2 things: an immediate load restriction of 20 tons and closure of the 2 eastern lanes until the connection could be opened up and inspected properly. I sent it to the project office, to the structural engineering group, and to the office of the chief executive, because that is what the escalation procedure required. Then I waited. And while I waited, I sat in my truck eating a gas station sandwich and looking at a photograph of my daughter taped to the dash. Her name is Sadie. She was 11, and she had drawn a shark on the corner of the picture for reasons she has never explained. I remember thinking that I would be home in time to make dinner. I was, but nothing else about that day went the way I planned. The meeting happened over video at 4 in the afternoon, and I joined it from a folding chair in a construction trailer with a bad connection and a coffee stain on my sleeve. There were 9 faces in little rectangles, and I knew maybe 2 of them. The one who mattered was Preston Carrington, 57, chairman of the board and the largest single investor in Sterling Meridian, a man who wore a gray suit the way other men wear their own skin. He listened to my summary for 4 minutes. He did not ask a single technical question. He asked instead how many employees my company had, and when I told him 3, including me, he smiled the way a man smiles at a child explaining the rules of a game he invented. Then he said the sentence I have thought about 1,000 times since. He said, "We hired you to inspect. We did not hire you to run the company." He said the rehabilitation had been signed off by 2 licensed engineers already. He said a lane closure on that corridor would cost the project schedule dearly, and that a load restriction would trigger contract penalties, and that he was not going to reorganize a regional transportation network because a field contractor had a bad feeling. I told him it was not a feeling. It was a measurement, and I offered to walk anyone in the meeting through the data personally, on site. That evening, nobody volunteered. The silence in those 9 rectangles was the loudest thing I heard all year. Camille Sterling, the chief executive, was not in that meeting. She was 2 time zones away closing an acquisition that had taken her 8 months to build, and I learned much later that the report I had routed to her office never reached her desk in the form I wrote it. Somebody in Preston's orbit intercepted it, summarized it, softened it, and passed along a version that read like routine maintenance chatter. At the end of the call, a project manager sent me a document to sign, a certification that the structure was fully safe and fit for unrestricted service. There was a completion bonus attached to it, $18,000, more than I usually cleared in a quarter. I read it twice, and I did not sign it. My contract was suspended within the hour. I want to be honest about what I felt because people expect anger and I did not have any to spare. I felt tired, and under the tiredness I felt something older and colder that I had not felt in 12 years. The specific dread of knowing a thing that other people have decided not to know. I packed my gauges into their foam cases, backed up every photograph and every raw data file to 2 independent servers with certified timestamps, and printed a hard copy for the box I keep in my garage. Habit, procedure, muscle memory. Then I drove to the far end of the crossing and got out one last time to look at it in the low orange light. Mara Quinn was a structural engineer at Sterling Meridian, 35 years old, and she had been quietly agreeing with me for 11 days without being able to say so. She had run her own check on the East Truss in June and had flagged the same connection with the same concern in language that was, if anything, more alarming than mine. Her flag came back from review with the severity downgraded and a note suggesting she focus on items within her assigned scope. She had a mortgage, a specialty that only about 6 companies in the region hired for, and a supervisor who reported directly to Preston. So she did the thing that terrified her. On Thursday morning, she took my original report, the one I had written, and put it in front of Camille Sterling herself. I was not in that room, but Camille described it to me later with a precision that told me she had replayed it many times. She read my report standing up. Then she opened her own inbox and read the version her staff had provided, and she felt the floor tilt, because they did not match. Where I had written progressive loss of connection integrity with potential for chain instability, her copy said condition noted, recommend periodic monitoring. Where I had written recommend immediate load restriction and partial closure, her copy said contractor recommends continued observation. It was not fabricated from nothing. It was worse than that. It was my language, softened at exactly the places where softening would let the schedule survive. She went to Preston with both documents that afternoon. She told me he did not blink, not once, and that his calm was the most persuasive thing in the room. He said summarization was standard practice, that raw field reports were full of contractor hedging because contractors get paid to find problems, and that translating that into executive language was literally somebody's job. Then he opened a folder and gave her a portrait of me, a small subcontractor with 3 employees. No advanced management credentials. A single father whose wife had died 4 years earlier, who had walked away from a career and never explained why, who took short contracts and turned down long ones. A man, Preston suggested gently, who had been told no and was now inflating a maintenance issue into a catastrophe in order to sell a bigger scope of work. Then she noticed the detail that saved a number of lives, mine possibly included. She asked to see the certification document I had refused to sign, and she saw the bonus attached to it. $18,000 sitting there, and a contractor who supposedly wanted more money had turned it down and lost his contract instead. She looked at Preston and asked him to explain the incentive structure of a man who invents a crisis and then declines to be paid for ending it. He said I was building a lawsuit. She said maybe. But something in her had shifted, the way a weight shifts, and she made a decision she did not announce to anyone on her executive floor. She was going to drive out to the Hawthorne River Bridge herself that afternoon and put her own hand on the steel. At almost the same hour, I was in a school pickup line with the windows down waiting for Sadie when my phone buzzed with a traffic notice I had set up out of pure paranoia. A permitted heavy convoy, 4 transporters carrying turbine sections, gross weight well over 100 tons each, had been rerouted due to construction on the interstate. The new route ran east across the Hawthorne River Bridge, scheduled to begin crossing at 4:40 in the afternoon. I read it 3 times. That was the exact loading case I had written about, the concentrated slow-moving mass that would park enormous force directly over the panel points I did not trust. I called the permit office and got a voicemail tree. I called the county emergency line and told them who I was, and I heard the polite, careful tone people use when they are deciding whether you are a crank. Camille arrived at the bridge at 4. She had her driver pull onto the eastern shoulder near the second pier, and she got out in a wool coat and completely inappropriate shoes because she wanted to see the crack the reports kept mentioning. She found it easily, which should have told her everything. She crouched down, put 2 fingers into a fissure in the deck surface that had not been there in the photographs from the completion package, and felt cold air moving through it from below. Then, in a gap between passing vehicles, she heard something she could not name. A small sound. Not a bang, not a crack. A slow, dry, grinding whisper like a heavy drawer being dragged over sand, coming up through the concrete under her feet. I heard it too from the eastern approach, standing beside my truck with my door still open. And I knew exactly what it was, because I had heard that sound once before, a long way from home, in a country where the bridge in question had been thrown together in 9 days by exhausted men. It is the sound of steel sliding out of a connection it was supposed to be locked into forever. It is the sound a structure makes when it stops being one thing and becomes a collection of pieces that happen to be leaning on each other. I stood there for half a second while my entire life reorganized itself around a single fact. The chain had started. Nothing on this earth was going to stop it now. I called it in with the exact words that get a dispatcher to move, which are not the words most people use. I gave the structure name, the milepost, the nature of the failure, and the phrase imminent collapse, request full closure, both approaches. Then I put the phone in my chest pocket and left it on. I ran up the eastern approach, waving both arms at oncoming traffic in a pattern that is not a civilian gesture, and a semi-driver read it correctly and jackknifed to a stop across 2 lanes, which was the single luckiest thing that happened all day, because it corked the eastern entrance. Behind him, a dozen cars stacked up. Ahead of him, on the span itself, there were maybe 30 vehicles. The heavy convoy was 4 minutes out, and, thanks to that driver, would never get on. So I stopped running and started directing. I climbed onto the hood of a stopped delivery van where people could see me, and I used the 2 things that actually move a panicked crowd, which are a voice pitched low instead of high, and instructions that are absurdly specific. Leave the vehicles, I said. Do not go back for anything. Walk. Do not run along the white line on the upstream side, single file, toward the tall gray tower. I picked the upstream side because the deck was cambering downstream. I told them to walk because running produces impact loads, and 30 people landing in rhythm on a compromised deck is a hammer. 11 people obeyed immediately. The rest followed the 11, which is how crowds always work. That is when I saw the black SUV at the center of the span tilted, its front wheels turned hard, a deformed section of steel guardrail folded across the driver's side like a closed hand. A man in a suit was on the deck beside it, on his hands and knees, bleeding from the forehead, being pulled away by 2 men in work vests. That was the driver, and he had gotten out. Through the windshield glare, I could see a woman in the passenger compartment pushing at a door that was never going to open, and I recognized her from a photograph in an annual report I had read 4 days earlier in a construction trailer while eating a sandwich. It was Camille Sterling, the chief executive of the company that had suspended my contract for refusing to lie. Reaching her took 90 seconds, and I spent most of them looking at the truss instead of the vehicle, which she noticed and did not understand. The SUV had come to rest with its downstream side low, which meant gravity was working against the driver's door and for the rear passenger glass. I anchored the strap to the guardrail post 2 panels back, where I could see the connection was still sound, ran the winch line to the SUV's frame, and took up tension until the vehicle stopped its slow creep toward the edge. Then I punched the rear window with the center punch, which turns tempered glass into a curtain of harmless pebbles in about 1 second. And reached through to unlock and force the rear door against the tilt. She came out over the seatbacks, coat torn, 1 shoe gone, and stood on the deck, breathing like a swimmer. She looked at my face, and I watched recognition arrive. "You?" she said. And then, almost immediately, because she was quicker than most people give executives credit for, she asked the real question. "Have you done this before?" I told her the truth, which was, not with this bridge. She started to say something else, and I put my hand flat against her sternum and told her to be quiet and listen, because underneath us the groan had changed pitch, moving up the scale the way a rope does before it parts. I turned us west toward the exit I had come from, and that was the moment the deck between us and safety dropped out of the world. It did not fall like a curtain. It went in stages, a section of roadway maybe 80 feet long sagging, tearing free of its stringers with a sound like a building being unzipped, and then simply not being there anymore. Dust came up in a wall. Somewhere below, a great slap of water. Where I had walked 40 seconds earlier, there was now open air and the Black River 110 feet down, and on the far side of that gap I could see the last of the crowd reaching the western abutment and turning to look back at the 2 of us, marooned on a wounded island of steel that was still, actively, in the process of dying. Here is what I could see that she could not. The eastern approach looked intact because the roadway surface was continuous, but the truss beneath it was doing something ugly, and the pattern of the paint cracking along the lower cord told me that whole section had already handed off its load and was riding on friction and habit. Meanwhile, the upstream edge girder, the outermost beam, the one hanging out over the water with nothing under it, was still fully connected and still delivering force cleanly down to the eastern pier. It looked like the most exposed place on the bridge. It was the last solid thing on it. I have spent my life explaining to people that the frightening path and the dangerous path are frequently different paths, and I have almost never been believed as fast as I needed to be. We went out onto the girder. I kept one hand on the top flange and put her between me and the truss so that if she slipped she would fall inward. I told her to match my steps and to keep her eyes on my back rather than on the water, and to breathe out on every step because people hold their breath when they are frightened, and holding your breath makes you rigid, and rigid people fall. The bridge talked to us the entire time. Every few seconds, something below let go with a sound like a rifle shot, and each time she flinched, and each time I told her calmly, that one was 3 panels away, that one was underneath the roadway we left, that one does not concern us. Half of that was analysis, half of it was the oldest trick in emergency work, which is that a calm voice reciting facts is a load-bearing structure all by itself. 60 feet along, a rescue worker on the eastern bank started screaming at us through a bullhorn to come back and take the roadway, that they had a ladder truck positioning at the east abutment. Camille's whole body turned toward the sound, because a uniform with a bullhorn is an authority, and I was a man in torn work pants. I said her name the first time I had used it, and I said, "Look at the lower cord under that roadway, look at the paint." She looked. There was a bright line of exposed metal running along it where the coating had split, which meant that member was elongating, which meant it was accepting attention it was never designed for. I said, "That is a member failing in slow motion, and we cannot be standing on top of it when it finishes." She stayed with me. 9 seconds later, that entire eastern section came down, 200 feet of it, roadway and truss together, dropping in one piece and then folding as it went, and the ladder truck they wanted us to walk toward reversed hard and got clear by maybe 15 feet. The blast of air that came off it pushed us sideways against the truss. Camille had her fingers locked around a rivet head so tightly that she tore 2 fingernails and did not notice until an hour later. She did not scream. She looked at the place we would have been standing, and then she looked at me, and something in her face rearranged permanently. I have been on the receiving end of that look a handful of times in my life, and I have never once enjoyed it. The last 40 feet were the hardest, because the deformed guardrail had wrapped itself around the girder, and there was no clean way through, only over. I got across first, wedged my boots into the connection angle, and reached back for her. She was past the end of her strength by then. Her arms had that fine tremor that means the tank is empty, and she told me she did not think she could pull herself up. So I told her she did not have to, that her only job was to keep her feet on the flange and let me do the lifting, and I got a fistful of her coat collar and the back of her belt and hauled her over the rail while the deck behind us dropped another 6 inches. We went down the embankment on our backsides through gravel and dead grass and were still moving when the center of the Hawthorne River Bridge finally let go. Camille lay on her back in the gravel with dust caked in the lines around her eyes. I did not celebrate. What I felt was an itemized list. I got up, found the incident commander, and told him which remaining pier was unstable, where the debris field would shift, and how many vehicles I had counted on the deck versus how many drivers I had seen walk off. 40 minutes later, the heavy engines arrived. A Marine Combat Engineer detachment had been running a bridging exercise at a training area 19 miles northeast, and somebody with sense had called them because they had cranes, cutting equipment, boats, and 200 people who practice exactly this. They came down the eastern access road in a column, and the effect on the scene was immediate. Competence has a smell, and everybody relaxes when it shows up. By then I had walked the debris line 3 times and marked with orange spray paint from a county truck a set of zones along the southern bank where I was fairly certain a secondary collapse would drop the remaining approach span. I was standing in the middle of the wreckage using hand signals to hold a rescue team back from one of those zones when I noticed I had an audience. Hand signals are just a habit. They are faster than shouting over engines, and they do not degrade over distance. But they are a specific vocabulary, and the young Marine watching me knew that vocabulary, and the sight of a filthy civilian in torn work pants it correctly did not fit anywhere in his head. I heard him say to the man beside him who gave that guy authority. It was a fair question. Nobody had. The man beside him was Colonel Grant Holloway, 49 years old, and he did not answer because he had stopped walking. He was looking at my paint marks. Not at me, at the marks. There were 9 of them, and their spacing and their notation followed a particular triage convention for rapid structural assessment under emergency conditions, one that assigns a specific symbol to a member's residual capacity and a specific arrow convention to the direction of anticipated failure. It is not something a highway inspector uses. It is not something you find in a civilian textbook. It is a field procedure, and it lives in a training annex, and Colonel Holloway had taught it for 2 years at Camp Lejeune. He stood in the dust for a long moment. Then he said, "Hold on. Who is that man?" He walked straight at me across 100 yards of broken concrete, and I saw him and knew precisely what was about to happen, which is why I kept working until he was 10 feet away. He asked my name. I told him Nolan Avery, and I went back to sighting down the approach span. He did not move. He said it again as a question, this with a rank in front of it. Avery. Captain Nolan Avery. And I stood up and looked at him properly for the first time and said, "Not for 12 years, sir." I need to explain the shape of what he knew because the truth is smaller and better than the rumor that grew afterward. I was not a secret legend. I was a Marine combat engineer officer with a specialty in rapid assessment of bridges, ports, and evacuation routes in degraded environments, which is a narrow and deeply unglamorous field. 12 years ago, my team was attached to a disaster relief mission after an earthquake, and we were tasked with certifying a temporary river crossing that 3,000 displaced people were queued up to use. I looked at it for 11 minutes and said no. That was not popular. There were people with more rank than me who needed that crossing open, and there was a very long argument in a very hot tent. I held the line and we cleared it, and we pushed the crossing point 2 miles downstream, which cost 8 hours nobody wanted to spend. The temporary bridge collapsed the following morning under its own weight plus rain, with 4 engineers on it who had time to walk off because I had also insisted on a spotter and a signal. Nobody died. That is the entire story. Afterward, the assessment protocol my team had cobbled together out of necessity was written up, refined by better people than me, and folded into an instructional package that young engineers now run as a training scenario. They gave it a name in the annex. Some instructors just call it the Hawkeye problem. Most of the Marines who work through it have no idea a person is attached to it at all, which is exactly how it should be. I left the Corps 2 years later, and the reason had nothing to do with the service. My wife, Elise, died in the spring quickly and unfairly, and Sadie was 7 years old and had 1 parent remaining. I had watched other men try to run that particular equation with the deployment schedule, and I had seen the answer it produces. So I put in my papers, took my skill set into the civilian market, and deliberately took contracts small enough that I could be home for dinner. I did not talk about the past, not out of modesty and not out of some wound. I simply refused to let the best years of my daughter's life be narrated by a rank I no longer held. When people assumed I was nobody, I let them, because correcting them cost more than it ever paid. Behind Colonel Holloway, the young Marine had followed at a distance, and I heard him ask, quietly, the question that people ask when a story becomes a person. "Sir, is he actually the guy from the Hawkeye scenario?" Holloway did not turn around, he said. He wrote part of it. Then he asked me, with a directness I appreciated, what I had been doing on this bridge, and I told him the whole thing in about 90 seconds. The connection at panel point 9, the material mismatch, the report, the meeting, the suspension, the convoy permit. He listened without a single interruption. When I finished, he said, "You filed a formal written warning 36 hours ago." I said, "Yes." He said, "And they suspended you." I said, "Yes." And Holloway looked out at 600 feet of steel lying in a river and said nothing at all for a while. Camille had been sitting on the bumper of an ambulance the whole time with a blanket over her shoulders, close enough to hear every word. She heard a Marine colonel identify me by a rank her company's chairman had never bothered to look for. She heard the young Marine's question and the answer. And she was doing arithmetic of her own, the kind that leaves marks, because 48 hours earlier she had sat in a conference room and been shown a folder that described me as an unqualified small contractor with a grievance, and now combat engineers with cranes were walking over to ask my opinion about which pier to work under. She got up and came toward us, still barefoot, and she started to say something that had the shape of an apology or a thank you in it. I stopped her, and I have wondered since whether I was too blunt, but I do not think I was wrong. I said what I used to be does not matter. It does not change one bolt of what happened here. What matters is that your company was warned in writing 36 hours ago with photographs and measurements, and somebody decided you did not need to see it. She stood there in the dust with her mouth slightly open and no answer at all. And behind her on the eastern access road, a black car was coming down toward the incident perimeter, moving fast. Preston Carrington arrived with 2 attorneys and a crisis communications director, and by the time he had walked 40 feet from his car, he was already narrating. I watched him do it, and I will admit it was a masterful performance. He went to the incident commander first, offered every corporate resource, and used the phrase whatever the community needs. He went to the injured driver and put a hand on his shoulder. Then he found the nearest official microphone and delivered the story he intended everyone to accept. An unforeseeable event, a structure that had passed all required inspections, an unusual loading condition, a tragedy nobody could have predicted. He said the word unpredictable 4 times in 90 seconds. Repetition is how a false story gets installed. Then he did something clever and ugly. He mentioned with great reluctance that a contractor whose engagement had recently been terminated had been observed on the structure prior to the incident, and that while he would not speculate, the company would be cooperating fully with any inquiry into unauthorized activity on site. He never said my name. He did not have to. He was building a room in advance the way he always did, so that anything I said later would arrive inside a frame of suspicion he had constructed first. Camille heard it. I watched her face while she heard it, and I watched her decide something, and I watched her keep her mouth shut, because she was a chief executive with no evidence and a chairman who controlled the board. What Preston did that evening, from the back of his car, was the thing that ended him, though it would take 3 weeks for that to become visible. He instructed a compliant person in the technology department to purge a specific internal mail thread, dated across a 9-day window, and to do it in a way that would look like a routine retention policy. It was, I think, an act of pure reflex, the instinct of a man who had spent 35 years believing that documents exist only where he can reach them. He deleted his copies. He deleted Camille's copies. He deleted the project office copies, and he genuinely believed that was all the copies. But I am a contractor with a professional license and an insurance carrier, and men like me live inside a discipline that men like Preston have never had to learn. Every measurement I take is written to a device that stamps it. Every photograph carries embedded data. Every report I issue is deposited, on the day I issue it, in an independent archive that my liability policy requires, along with a hash that proves the file has not been altered since. I do this not because I am suspicious, but because 11 years ago an attorney explained to me exactly how a field engineer becomes the person who gets blamed. I had the original report. I had the raw strain data. I had 400 photographs of panel point 9. And Mara Quinn, who was braver than anybody in that company understood, had her June assessment and the internal markup showing precisely who downgraded it. There was one more thing, and it was the thread that unraveled everything, because it was the one fact that turned negligence into something a prosecutor could hold. The steel in that replaced connection was not what the approved design called for. The plate had a mill certification traceable to a supplier that appeared nowhere in the original procurement package. Its yield characteristics were below specification, and it had been installed under a change order that had been approved on cost grounds after the rehabilitation was already underway. Failures like that never come out of nowhere. They are ordered and signed and filed, and somebody saves money that quarter. We ended up standing in a temporary command tent that night, the 4 of us, because Camille asked me to explain the sequence to her directly, and Preston came in behind her uninvited. He tried the tactic that had always worked for him, which was to make me small in front of the person whose opinion mattered. He said, with enormous courtesy, that he was grateful for what I had done, truly, and then he said, "But pulling one woman out of a car does not mean you understand a corporation worth several $billion." He said it lightly. Everyone in the tent heard the blade in it. There are maybe 4 seconds in my life I would pay money to watch again, and those were 4 of them. Preston's face did not change at all, which was itself the tell, because a man with nothing to hide asks what you are talking about. Camille turned around very slowly. She said, "What signature?" He said it was a clerical matter. She said the word again as a question, and this time it was not a question anybody in the tent could survive answering casually. He said they would discuss it internally. She said, "No, we will discuss it now." And the crisis communications director, God bless him, chose that exact moment to suggest that everyone step outside, which was the closest thing to an admission the room was ever going to get. The investigation took 11 weeks, and it did not find a conspiracy, because there was not one. I want to say that plainly, because people always want the story where a rich man wants a bridge to fall, and that story is comforting in a way the truth is not. Preston Carrington never wanted the Hawthorne River Bridge to collapse. He would have paid a fortune to prevent it, right up until the moment preventing it cost him a schedule. What he did was more ordinary and, to my mind, worse because it can happen at any company in this country next Tuesday. Here is the actual sequence. 2 days ago, Sterling Meridian bid the rehabilitation aggressively to win a corridor package, and the margin was thin from the first day. Preston, as chairman and principal investor, pushed a cost reduction program through the project. A cheaper steel supplier was substituted under a change order. Then the schedule slipped, and the corridor contract carried a completion milestone attached to a follow-on award worth several $100 million, and a lane closure at Hawthorne would have breached it. So a culture formed, the way weather forms, in which technical warnings were routinely reclassified downward, and in which the word requires became the word recommends, and in which nobody ever said stop. Stopping was the only unforgivable act. Mara Quinn produced the message that closed the circle, an internal note Preston had written in April to the project director. "Do not close the bridge without direct evidence of failure." 11 words. He almost certainly thought he was being disciplined and rational when he wrote them, insisting on evidence rather than anxiety. But think about what that sentence actually demands of a structure. It says the only acceptable proof that a bridge is unsafe is a bridge that has already failed. I had spent 36 hours trying to supply the evidence that policy required, and the policy had been carefully written so that no evidence I could ever produce would count. Camille sat with all of it in a conference room for 2 days, and what she did next is the reason I eventually said yes to her. She did not position herself as a victim of her chairman, which she was, and which any competent attorney would have advised her to do. She said, in a recorded session with counsel present, that she had not ordered anything concealed and had not known, and that this was not a defense. She had built the organization. She had approved a reporting structure in which field warnings traveled upward through the people whose bonuses depended on the schedule. She had rewarded executives for delivering good news and had never once asked what happened to the bad news. Nobody hid the bridge from her, she said. The company she designed did. Preston moved before she could finish assembling the file. He called an emergency session of the board and proposed removing Camille as chief executive, framing it as decisive governance in a crisis, and he had the votes to do it, or believed he did, because he controlled 2 seats directly and had known 3 of the other members for 30 years. He arrived that morning entirely confident. I know that because I was standing in a hallway on the 31st floor when he walked past me and did not recognize me, which tells you everything about how much attention he had ever paid. The session opened and Preston spoke for 11 minutes about stability and investor confidence and the need for leadership untouched by the incident. Then Camille placed a bound folder on the table and said she would not contest the vote, but that there was one more person the board should hear before it was taken. Somebody asked who, she said. The engineer who signed the first warning. And the door opened. I want to be precise about how I walked into that room because it was the single most deliberate thing I did in the entire affair. Not as the man who pulled a chief executive off a collapsing bridge, which was luck and geometry and would have made me a story rather than a witness. I came in as the licensed inspector who issued a written condition report at 11:20 on a Tuesday morning with attachments, and I said so in my first sentence. If I had walked in as the hero, Preston could have handled me. Heroes are emotional. Heroes can be provoked into overreaching in front of a board. Inspectors are just tedious, and tedium is bulletproof. He tried the obvious attack within 2 minutes. He said, with a small smile, that he understood I had a military background and that he had great respect for it, and that he wondered whether decisions made under battlefield instinct translated well into corporate risk management. It was a decent trap. If I defended my service, I would look wounded, and if I attacked him, I would look exactly like the reckless man his folder described. So I said that I agreed instinct was a poor basis for governance, and that this was why I had brought measurements. Then I turned on the display. I did not give a speech. I put up the approved design drawing for panel point 9, and beside it a photograph of what was actually installed, and I let 11 people look at 2 things that did not match for a full silent minute. I put up the mill certificate and the specification line item. I put up the strain data from the Monday afternoon, and then the same graph with the design prediction overlaid, and I pointed at the gap between them without editorializing. Finally, I put up 2 documents side by side. My original condition report and the version that reached the chief executive's office with the 11 altered passages highlighted in yellow. I said I did not write the sentences on the right. That was the whole of my argument. Mara Quinn confirmed the June assessment and identified the manager who had downgraded her severity rating. Camille produced the mail thread recovered intact from an archive Preston had not known existed and from Mara's own retained copy. An outside forensic technology firm testified in writing that a deletion request had been issued on the evening of the collapse, by whom and at what time, and that timing is a language all its own. Preston made the mistake that men like him always make at the end, which is that he kept talking after the room had stopped believing him. He raised his voice for the first time in my presence. He said the word unpredictable again, and it landed like a dropped plate. The board suspended him within the hour, referred the entire file to federal investigators and the National Transportation Safety Authorities, and voted to fund an independent review of every active structure in the portfolio. Colonel Holloway never involved himself in any of the corporate proceedings, and I respected him enormously for it. He provided one factual statement describing conditions his unit found on arrival and the stabilization work they performed, and that was all. He told me later that he had considered saying more and had decided that a Marine's testimony about a company's ethics was not his to give. Only the state of the wreckage was. They wanted me to say something crushing at the end. I could feel it in the room, that appetite, and I have watched men take that invitation and I have never seen it make anything better. So I gave them the only thing I actually believe, which is that a bridge does not care how rich the person signing the checks is. It does not care about a schedule, or a follow-on award, or a chairman's confidence. It only cares whether the load exceeds what it can carry. Then I gathered my documents, thanked the board for its time, and went down to the parking garage to get my truck, because Sadie had a science project due, and I had promised to help with the poster. 5 months later, the Hawthorne River Bridge was under reconstruction, and the new inspection protocol governing it was the strictest I have ever worked under. Preston Carrington lost his chairmanship, his board seats, and eventually a great deal more, and he is currently facing consequences that have nothing to do with me and everything to do with what he wrote in April. Camille Sterling kept her position after the independent review, determined she had neither ordered nor known of the concealment, but she did not keep it quietly. She accepted responsibility publicly, in language her attorneys hated, and then she rebuilt the safety organization from the studs. She came to find me on a Saturday in October at a small job site where I was checking a pedestrian overpass, and she stood in the gravel in sensible boots this time and waited until I finished. I assumed a check was coming. There is always a check in these stories, some enormous number meant to close an account, and I had already decided what I would say. She did offer one. I turned it down, and I want to be clear that this was not nobility. It was arithmetic. A payment to me would have been the cheapest possible ending, and cheap endings are exactly how the next bridge gets built. Then she made a different offer, and I had not seen it coming. Director of Independent Structural Safety, a new function reporting to the board rather than to operations, with the authority to halt any project on technical grounds without the consent of the finance organization. Real authority. Written into the corporate governance documents, not a title on a card. I told her I would think about it, and I thought about it for 9 days, and then I gave her 3 conditions and told her the offer was void without any one of them. First, any field engineer on any site must be able to send a warning directly to the safety board with no supervisor able to summarize, soften, or intercept it. Second, no bonus, no incentive, and no performance measure anywhere in the company may reward keeping a project moving while a Severity 1 warning is open, because you cannot ask people to be brave against their own mortgage. Third, my department has the standing right to publish a technical disagreement, in writing outside the company if it is overruled. She read the list twice and asked me if the third one was negotiable. I said no. She signed it that afternoon. In November, Colonel Holloway invited us to a small ceremony at his unit, nothing formal. An afternoon where a training company completed a certification and families ate barbecue on folding tables. I took Sadie, who was 12 by then and had opinions about everything. Nobody announced my name, and I did not want them to. I stood at the edge of a field holding a paper plate while my daughter interrogated a staff sergeant about how a floating bridge stays floating, and he answered her with the complete seriousness that good instructors give to genuine questions. The young Marine from the riverbank was there, and I watched him look at me for a while and then go over to Holloway and ask, quietly enough that he thought I could not hear, whether that was really Captain Avery. Holloway took a long moment with it. Then he said, "No, Captain Avery is who he used to be." He was watching me crouch down to Sadie's height to look at something she had drawn on a napkin, and he said, "That is Nolan Avery." The young man did not entirely understand. I expect he will in about 15 years. We drove home before dark, no uniform, no ribbons, no plaque, the same pickup with 196,000 miles on it now and a shark drawing still taped to the dash. Sadie fell asleep somewhere around the county line with her mouth open. I am still a single father who eats too much gas station food and who cannot get a stain out of a work sleeve to save his life, and almost nothing about my life looks different from the outside. Only one thing changed, and it is the only thing I ever actually wanted. The next time I say a bridge is not safe, nobody is going to ask whether I am important enough to be listened to.